Okay, welcome back. This is Oddborg Engine Techniques Part 2. It outlines some of the other aspects of the game development that we haven't really touched on. You'll remember this from last time. It's one wrapped segment that can be plugged in, kind of like a Lego. Now, let's say, for instance, we have these parts and we wanted to try them out. You'll remember from last time there was there is sort of an amalgam here of parts. Zoom out, and you can see that the parts are here. Okay, no. There we go. So remember, this part fit in, and then we'd have to recut it. Once you have a lot of parts, let's say you had these parts, you have that computer. This isn't going to make sense in the way that the world works, but whatever. For an example, we'll just take a look at it. So we're going to create a really big image that it doesn't really matter how big it is as far as the precision of the size of the asset. But the point is that we're creating kind of a mock-up of the level by putting the parts together to see how they work in tandem. So I'll just stick this part in there. This is a rather large piece, so this would have been cut up. But that's there in the level. Now we don't actually have any real slides of the protagonist yet, so I'm going to show you this mock-up which I've sent. So here we have a mock-up. Now each of these are actual tiles. Here's our main character. Gives you a general idea of how big he's going to be compared to the other parts and pieces. You can imagine him with the right arrow key moving to the right or left. Now, what isn't captured here is the layering that's going on. So let's talk briefly about the layering and how that affects the types of pieces that I would want to see as a level developer. So again, a lot of this is reinventing the wheel, but it's done in a very precise way, only because I've collected these skills by examining games and such. In fact, research is an important aspect of our record keeping, and so it's important to the overall creation of parts. So here we have a part. Okay, now if the part is actually two parts here. We have the part that goes from there to there, and then we have another part that goes from approximately here to here. So this is two tile pieces. So you would cut it so that it could be fit together. So let's look here. So approximately right after the gray, if you zoom in, you can see there's a gray edge. So it'll be right after the gray so that they fit together. But you'll note that there's this curve here, so it's actually fitting together a little bit farther up. So this actually may not work. So I can't cut the piece out of that. This would have to be an entirely custom segment with its own Y-top being right around there. So then there's this piece, but it's actually this piece without the shade, and then a shade overlaid. So the shade is its own tile, and it would be approximately the same size as that tile, or perhaps not, but as long as the upper left-hand corner matched, it could be used in that respect. So shadows have to be sort of added. Now some of that I can do as a level developer while building it, but some of it, as it's intended, it would be better if we had this huge mock-up. So I've created this massive image, and here's a piece in there. Let's grab some stuff off the mock-up and pretend it's some final parts. So we're going to take this segment, which is actually a 128 by I think 256 or maybe 512 segment. Let's see how big it is. Yeah, it's 128 by 256 approximately. So we're going to grab the it precisely. We just pretend it's precise. And this is again so that you can look at the color content and the relative scale. So if we zoom in, we can see that, okay, so it's a metal part, so it would sit approximately there, and that's what that would look like. Okay, so if you wanted to use this same part to describe the outside of, say, a structure, okay, you could create multiple pieces and and just sort of see what's that going to look like. Now in the game, of course, the level designer has to make decisions on where the stuff ends up. That's for balancing and game design reasons. But by and large, if it's a repeatable part, you can build multiple structures out of it. So it's kind of like designing a Lego playset. And here we have that one part. Okay, now this isn't necessarily what it's going to look like, but these are just examples. So then we have this specialized section with the skull. If we look at this particular drawing, it's not the same as the other, so let's add that to the mix here. So now we've got the bottom layer, and then we have this top layer, and we can move that up, and then we want to use linear dodge to eliminate the blacks. So you see how it's actually like a glow. So if you zoomed in, you can see, well that's kind of like how the glow effect is added, right? So that's something to take into account, the type of blending that we're going to be using. So this is just one type of blending. If we wanted to create the illusion that there was a ledge up here, and again, this isn't a perfect example, but it's one. You can see that in this particular level, it would look something like that. Now, obviously, I don't have enough parts that are specialized to these particular looks, but we're just working with what we have. In this particular mock-up, these planets, we want them to move at a different rate than the window that they're in. So we would want the planet isolated. Now, this comes from an online image. I don't know if it's for airplay, for instance, but you take a segment here and just sort of isolate the planet and then fill the external part with black. We now have something that we can add to a graphic. So we have the planet. Now let's say we had on the same mock-up, and ignoring that there's this foreground part, let's just take a segment here and okay, now we've got that. Now we're going to eliminate the foreground temporarily. This is just as an example. Let's grab the section here and sort of remove that section. Let's remove it to black. Okay. So what we would do is you can have the window as the background area, you know, the portal. You can have that as one segment with a black area in the center, or you can optionally take the area in the center and make an image out of that, and on that layer, let's create another layer. On that layer, you would create the window's reflective quality. So you would want to just do the reflection. Now, of course, we can use shaders and other technology to create the illusion using a layered material, which I'll show you in a second, to create the illusion of a moving distortion. As the player moves in front of it, a fuzzy version of the player would appear behind it. Additionally, there would be some content that would create the glare of the window. So that is a separate technique. This is just the cheap version that will work for a modicum of quick and dirty effects. So we're going to use both, but we don't have time to do it for each one, maybe, or I don't know. We have the option of doing more than one technique, and anytime you can use more than one technique, you actually create a richer experience, even if, because all of the techniques are just kind of fudged approximations of reality. So if you have several different types of fudged approximations, this looks like a richer experience. And that's something that we've learned totally on accident by video games using the same engines over and over. So we'll create a glare here. Let's select the interior segment. Now, it's not perfectly lined up. I would normally perfectly line it up so that it was only the interior of this, but we're just doing this quickly. So now we've got a glare, okay, and I would copy that out, all right, or keep it in a layer, and then I would save it like this, where there's alpha channel, or I would use a black background to indicate where transparent was. You have the option of using either a black background or a white background as, or rather, in OpenGL you can go and say black is transparent, or you can go and say white is transparent. In this case, we would say that black is transparent and that white is not. So this particular glow would not move, but you can imagine it would look something like this if it was assembled in the engine. You would see it look kind of like this. Okay, and that creates kind of an illusion there, and then on top of that we would overlay a perfect replication of the main character so that it appeared like he had a reflection on the glass that was also glared. So so that gives you one idea. Now we can set the speed at which this moves relative to the window moving and the background itself moving. We can also have a third background way in the back that moves very slowly. This is called Parallax Scrolling. And for instance, if I wanted to go to Google here and you know, you would create this content, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm not creating any new content real quick for this. So let me see, space scene. Okay, so we want like a space scene behind that, so we would pick a nice public domain image of a space scene, you know, certainly free to do that. And then we would stick that in the back, okay, and we would actually be using, oops, adjustments, layers. We're using a linear dodge here, okay, so it would look something like this. Now, maybe you don't want that to have the stars in front of it, okay, so if you can imagine the game moving, this would move, say, at this rate, or even slower than that. It would move like that, okay. And then in front of it, you'd have the planet moving like that fast, and the entire section would be moving. So there would be 3 layers there to do this parallax on that level. Now, this additive method is the most common and easiest to use method, but it's not the only method. So what you'll find yourself doing, and as a level designer or a tile designer, you know, whoever's in charge of that, and of course I'll need help with that, but if you have say a character that's cut out, we'll use the planet as an example. Let's use a piece of one of these planets instead. We'll use this one down here. So you can't see that, but here I'll zoom in. So there's this planet here, and we're going to select this section. Okay, and we're going to copy that. We're going to create a new image, right? And we're going to actually change the size of it now after pasting. We're going to say image size, and it looks like it's pretty close to 64 by 64. We'll lose a little data there, but no big deal. Okay, now we're set. We've got it in a layer, so we're going to add one more layer, and that's going to, so essentially this layer, this top layer, which is the planet itself, becomes the cutout. So we're going to take the second layer and we're going to apply black, and now we have a cutout that's black. Okay, so black, and then color map, okay, masking map. All right, so, and it's a mask 1, which means, I'm sorry, it's a mask 0, which means that black is the area that is, no, it is a mask 1. Mask 1 means that if it's white, it won't draw it. And if it's a transitive color like that, it will draw it with an anti-aliasing property. So, so for blending. So we'll see this wonderful color map, and then that will have been applied to this map, which is the ideal map of mask 0, or mask 1. Sorry, mask 1. And so you'll have to save both of these images, and in fact, the color map portion will actually have to have a black background. So this would be one image saved, and then this would be the other image that you save. And this creates a masked, color-mapped region that's drawn in 2 passes. And what that allows us to do is and that'll be the most common technique probably for all of the animations that involve cutouts and masking. So that's how that works. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, if it's in a background and it can just be applied additively, or if it has a black background, like we could save time by using a black background here, and then we can just apply this as an add. If it's masked on top of it, it's going to look, normal like that. So that would be what would happen if you had an additive on black background in the back with this particular tile, and then you had like a masked thing in front of it. So you have this sort of layering. And you might have seen this stuff before in other programs, but I'm just sort of going through what we have. And so the other option we have actually is a difference. We can do, or not difference, maybe it's exclusion or something. I'm not really sure. We have one solarization effect, and there's several other effects. There's a multiply effect, etc. There's the add. So you can see how adding, there's definitely a transparency to it, whereas masking has more of a rigid edge, and it's added to a black background. So there's within this shape. So that's the technique that we'll use for that to create art assets for that purpose. Then there's, we talked about the wrapping last time, how it wraps or maybe it plugs in a certain order, things like that. And then you've created this mock-up of the level just to play the pieces off each other, to see if the colors that you chose work well together, to see what the overall thing is, just to get an idea of what's my level going to look like. Again, it's all repeatable, so the final level actually may be several times this size. Like, if you can zoom out here, you see how big it is on this 6,000 by 6,000 image. But if you could imagine an even bigger area, say 5 times to the right and left, you can sort of get a feel for how big the game could be. Now, a lot of this hasn't been tested, and but from my personal experience, we're limited to about 25,000 objects, each with a unique animation technique. Well, that includes particles and bullets, and that's a very slow factor at 25,000. If we were down at like maybe 12,000, it would be pretty fast on a larger number of machines. And that's something to keep in mind as we develop these things. Now, if it's a static image, just like, we'll give that a weight of 1. So we'll say that this static image down here, or this one up here, even though it's blended, it gets a weight of 1. Okay? Now, if we have something that is moving, say it uses 30 frames, well, that's going to have a weight of 30, because there's 30 different drawings. If it's masked, it has a weight of 2, because it must write it. So as you add these components up, if I'm using tile 1 75 times, and it's, it stands for merely one of those 25,000. However, it does have this heavier weight, and weight is a different factor. So there's about 25,000 individual objects that can be manipulated at any one time, including particles, bullets, explosions, gas effects, volumetric effects, lighting effects, and shaded vertices, or VBOs rather, shaded VBOs. Each of those has a value of 1. For good performance, 8,000 is a lot. 5,000 is a lot. There may be some ways to optimize this using CUDA. I haven't fully explored that yet. It's certainly in the pipeline, but I need art assets now to kind of play with this engine and get it working with just a few assets. So we don't have to create everything at once, but of course, if people are working in parallel, that helps us move faster. So that's a technique for kind of seeing how the level is going to look. That's the bigger picture of it all. But you don't want to spend too much time on any one of these things. Like you might come to this view and need to go back to one of those previous views to kind of cut it in a different way or add a detail or add a variation. So say you have these 5 tiles and that works pretty well, but then you want somewhere else in the level to stick a barrel here. You could stick a barrel there that way, or you could give me a barrel and I could stick it there. That's if you want it to be hit and explode and things change to it, it needs to be separated out from the rest of it. Likewise, there's a wonderful number of options for this parallax. So even though I only demonstrated it with 3 levels, it could actually go up to like 12 levels or 16 levels. So you could have like many columns in the back and play with optics that way. And that's the end of today's mini lecture on different ways to produce stuff. We want to keep them clean, segmented. You need to kind of isolate them. And about 30 frames per second is the maximum we can promise. We probably will deliver actually less than that. But most of the time it'll be between 24 and 30 frames. Although it could technically go up to 60. It's alright. We're going to put a hard limit on animation at 30. And if we need to, unless of course, if you give me 60 frames, I'm only going to pick 30 of them. But if I want to slow it down to half the speed and have it look equally good, I would need those extra frames to render the slow motion effect. Now, we don't have any plans to add a slow motion effect, but that's certainly one we could do. There's other effects that we want to take a look at as well. This is just one example. There are many examples. We haven't talked about animation yet, but obviously objects can be rotated, and objects can respond to a physics simulation. Objects can also be programmed to work in tandem with one another, and there may be some sort of skeletal animation eventually or ragdoll physics, as it were, which is certainly plausible as well. And we have some of the underlying technology for that already. So we're moving in that direction, and that gives you a good idea. So the next steps will be to create some mock-ups, some general drawings, and some backgrounds and some stuff like that, and see what happens next. So use lots of layered files. Make sure to once in a while do a little upkeep and change the names of your layers to describe what they are. Let me give you an example of that. So we've been working on this one today, and we want to change the names of this. We'll call this reflection map or end map, okay, environment map. And we'll call this one the planet background. Could call it sprite or whatever, and then we'll call this the parallax level 0 background. Okay, so that's describing that it's all the way in the back. Actually, it would actually be level 1 if we wanted it to move. So 0 is a static, and then level 1 would be a slightly moving level. And we'll call this the mask layer. Mask layer background. And actually, even though I call it planet background, we might want to mention that we're going to do a mask 1 planet background, mask 1 color map. Okay, and now we're starting to describe what these layers are intended for, and that's a good practice there. If we look at, I guess before I go, we'll do the layered materials, just one example from the 3D part of the engine, and then talk about how that could be translated into 2D. So we have lots of options here because the sprite world, the shader world is very open-ended. Let's take a look at data, images. We've got materials here, I think. Wait, sounds, images. This is an older version. Hold on one second. This is from Empire in the Sky. It's one of our projects. Materials. This is actually the Oddborg itself. So, from video games, there are layered tiles. Here we have our world shader, which is actually just one of many shaders. This one is a very complex one. It's optimizable, done in code. It has, excuse me, it has a total of, I think, 9 layers, but you're only seeing some of them here. No, wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 layers. We have this descriptive text file, which talks about the types of mappings. Now this is for 3D, but you can pick any of these techniques. So you have additive, you've got subtractive, you've got normal mapping, which is a very special technique done in Blender for 3D, and this creates the illusion of parallax height mapping, which is yet another map type, and tile gloss map, which is the reflection off a surface that's uneven. This is done partly by daubing paint or using a fractal generator. Let me show you it in a larger view. This is so what you're seeing is kind of like a grain to the reflections off the surface, and black areas show no reflection, white areas show the highest amount of reflection depending on the angle of the light. So that's what that does. There's env mapping, which is a picture of the environment in which the object sits that is reflected. We can use this in the 2D world, but it isn't as effective as it is in the 3D world. However, it still will be effective, but requires us to model 3D objects, so there's some give and take there. I'll probably use a parametric equation to generate any objects like a round portal or something that reflects. We don't actually have to build a model for that, but we could easily. Now we've got Luminance Map, which basically is like an emissive color. It doesn't do the glow effect, but it does create some emission. There's a separate thing that does a glow effect, and we have not yet implemented that. Here we have a floor tile normal map. We went through that. Additive. A floor tile cover map and color map. So color map is just like I described earlier. A color map is basically what color is it before any of the other maps are applied. So you can see here it's tiles with kind of crummy grout, and it happens to be white tiles. Obviously, the additives are added on top, and the subtracts are then subtracted from the stack. So let me show you what the final amalgam. I don't think amalgam's the right word, but the mixture of all these things, the layered effect that occurs when using them, looks something like. Let's see. Some things are getting away from me here. Let's see here. Still with you. Just give me a moment. By the way, this sort of filter is definitely possible. The 3D kind of look. We might be able to add a special mode that does that. But let me see here. It's frustrating because I have so many files. I don't know. Stuff from my desktop. Wait a minute. Okay, so here we have a picture of, excuse me, a cube. Now you would imagine this in 2D, so it wouldn't be turned like that, but you can see it has a spotlight on it, and that spotlight works, and you can see that it has a slight height mapping there, and it doesn't have any additives. But here's one with many layers at a different angle. So you can see it has the height map, reflection map, which is and you can see it has a slight texture to it, and that's and here's another example down here. That is your gloss map. Then we have the additive and a subtractive layer, and there's two of each of those. Then if you see this pattern in here, that's actually the env map or environment map. And let's see. Oh, so these white cubes are the luminance map, and I think I may have another picture of that with a red luminance map. But yes, it indeed has several. Here's another picture of the same cube. The light itself is yellow, so the spotlight hitting it is yellow. We've got this is an additive map back here. Here we have another additive. This might actually be subtractive. And you can see that those ABCD is written on top of that. Here's the luminance map. Even in the dark, you can see it. We've got definitely a height map, although you note that the light is actually coming from the wrong direction. This is one bug we're trying to fix. You can see here that there's a depth to it, and there is, if you zoom in, a little bit of a gloss map. You can see the texture there. That kind of texture is definitely a gloss map. Here's another picture of the same shader. Again, to optimize, we pick and choose. So here we only have additive maps, or I think it's actually one additive, one subtractive map. You can see the subtractive map is actually written on top of the luminance map, and the luminance map happens to be red. So we're seeing kind of a nice glowing redness to that block. And if you look at the texture, you can see it has all those swirls and graininess, and that's the gloss map. Let's look at this without all of those extra layers. This is again, the light is wrong, and it has to be fixed. The light is coming from this direction, but also for some reason the one value is changed in the wrong direction. So we're seeing looks like the Y maybe, or the Z angle is not correct. Now, all that can be done, and this is a more advanced technique. It requires way more processing of stuff, but used sparingly and in the right places, it'll look great. We wanted to work on a wide variety of machines, so these are all kind of things to keep in mind. Let me show you another picture here. Here's another VBO mapped with a blue light luminance map, and the same sorts of techniques are used to render that using the gloss map, the height map. There's no additive map on this, so that gives you an idea of how we're coming up with some of the texture techniques. So you can use these techniques, but we should discuss in advance which ones, because you could go and look at OpenGL shaders and say, oh, I really like that one. We have to talk about that, and just to get an idea of how many shaders we want to implement. We certainly have a nice implementation of shaders, so we can do whatever we want, but each one takes more time. Here's an example of the level snapshot from the Oral-B game, and you can see they've created this mock-up. The final level did not look exactly like this, but it was pretty close. We could certainly see similar techniques in our current game. So there's all sorts of options here. It's just a matter of figuring out which ones we want to use for what particular objects. So really focus on what is the content of this. Having a list of things, thinking up some alien race and giving them special properties is a great way to go about it. And I will make as many suggestions as I can. I will prepare documents to describe these things, but of course, through the brainstorming process, we'll hopefully come up with a variety of new ideas together. So these are techniques for the Oddborg engine. Thank you very much, and I'm sure we'll be back in touch very soon. Take care. do I stop recording? There we go.